I think that there's a number of horror games out there that I have been a massive fan of over the years. From the initial release of their first game all the way to where we are now. I've enjoyed most of the titles within this franchise, and I believe it's one of the greatest shooter horror games, horror shooter titles that's ever come out. And that being Dead Space. And I want to talk about Dead Space, guys, because Dead Space 4 is a game that I have wanted to see, um, ever since the release of Dead Space 3. Because Dead Space 3, guys, if we go back, we had Dead Space 1 and 2, which I believe were two of the best horror, I would say horror shooter games I've ever played, closely observed. Like, I think that the first two Dead Space titles were unreal, incredible titles. Dead Space 3, though, was where I feel like they took a step in the wrong direction. They prioritized, this action over horror when you got to the third game, whereas the first two games was horror over action. There was certainly action, but they wanted to prioritize this very dark, gritty atmosphere within Dead Space to give you this very unnerving feeling. And ultimately, when we got to Dead Space 3, I just felt like EA was specifically trying to chase a trend, which was, action games over horror, and it just didn't make much sense. And so ultimately, after Dead Space 3 came out, sales weren't good. A lot of people were pretty critical of the title, the change of pace and everything else. And Dead Space went into a limbo state, a state of almost no return. And then all of a sudden, I should say it was like a month after the Callisto Protocol released, which was from the makers of Dead Space, the Dead Space remake came out from Team Motive over at EA. And the Dead Space remake, I thought was great. I thought it was outstanding. I loved it. I thought, it kind of really captured the magic of what Dead Space is all about once again for me. But it was, it kind of brought up the question like, okay, are they going to bring out another Dead Space game? Or is this are they going to do a Dead Space 2 remake, Dead Space 3 remake? Are they going to do a Dead Space 4? And so I want to talk about this specifically because I think it's important. Dead Space is one of the most iconic horror games of all time. When it came out, Glenn Schofield and the guys over at Visceral, they had no idea that this was going to be as popular and become such a cult classic title as it became. And, they did the first one. Obviously, Dead Space 2, I think, topped the first one. Dead Space 3, massive step in the wrong direction. Dead Space Remake, it's like, here we are, we're back. But where are we at this point in time? Well, let's talk about that. So, will Dead Space 4 ever happen? And where is Dead Space 4 at this point in time, guys? So, let's talk about it. EA rejected Dead Space 4 recently. This is why. So, guys, this is an article coming to us from Jake Brigstock over at Indie 100. Dead Space is a much loved third-person survival horror video game series where players take on the role of the unluckiest engineer in gaming, Isaac Clarke. The gameplay sees Isaac have to fight through hordes of horrific monsters called Necromorphs in hugely tense encounters as he battles through them to get to where he needs to be. Obviously, guys, we had the three main entries in the franchise, like the trilogy, I guess you could call it. Three main games were released between 2008 and 2013 with a few spin-offs along the way. Dead Space was also remade in 2023, much to the fanfare of its dedicated fan base. But it's understood that EA thought it did not sell as well as they hoped. It's reported EA thinks the series as a whole has underperformed in terms of sales during its lifespan, and the creators of Dead Space recently said in an interview with Dan Allen Gaming they pitched Dead Space 4 to EA but were rejected. And I'm just gonna like, I want to put this out there, guys. Let's say that Dead Space as a franchise didn't make a return or as much of a return for EA as they thought it would, which I have a hard time believing because the first two Dead Space titles, they sold very well. Now, the third game, yes, you could say it was a massive step in the wrong direction. EA probably, they could have very well lost money on Dead Space 3. But then the Dead Space remake comes out, and I think that, yeah, maybe it wasn't as good as they were hoping for, but I'm sure that they were profitable. Now, maybe they weren't. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But here's the thing. Let's just say that it underperformed and EA saying, oh, it's underperformed for, during its entire lifespan. We'll sell the IP then or license it out to another studio who's passionate about Dead Space. And then you guys can reap some of the benefits from when it releases. So like I'll give you guys a perfect example of this. Rockstar has the rights to Max Payne. They did a Max Payne 3, but they have done nothing since then. Remedy, the guys who do like Control, and a number of other games, Alan Wake, they have deep roots to Max Payne because they were the ones who worked on the first couple Max Payne titles. And so they ended up acquiring the rights or the license from Rockstar, and Rockstar licensed it out to them. So now they're doing a Max Payne 1 and 2 remake, which I think are going to be absolutely awesome. So what I'm saying is the moral of this is that I don't think that, you've got to just put Dead Space completely on the back burner in a limbo state or a state of no return. Like, just license it out to a studio that is passionate about it. License it out to these guys, Glenn Schofield. I mean, these guys know what they're doing. They have launched some, massive titles over the last number of years. But I think that, when I look at Dead Space as a franchise, and I look at the creators, and not only did they do Dead Space, they then did the Callisto Protocol, which, yeah, the Callisto Protocol, look, the reality is, guys, is that the Callisto Protocol suffered from, Krafton pushing the developers to release the game early, when it wasn't fully ready yet, because more than likely they wanted to stay ahead of the Dead Space remake because they thought if they released it after the Dead Space remake, they would just get crushed. But I think if they would have waited, just gave it some time, I think that the Callisto Protocol, I think it would have done really well if it just would have been fully polished, because they did polish the game, and I think the Callisto Protocol is awesome. But anyways, I just think it never really got a chance. And the other part that was completely asinine to me is that Dead Space, the remake, came out a month after the Callisto Protocol. So it's like the timing of Krafton and EA was completely crazy. Like, it was asinine, asinine. I don't care what anybody says. The fact that they put two games so similar to one another by the creators of Dead Space, who created the Callisto Protocol, and the Dead Space remake coming out a month later was, I mean, I think it hurt both games. I really do. So nonetheless, guys, it was crazy. I don't know why that whole thing happened, but EA should just license the game out. Just do it. Give it to Glenn Schofield, Christopher Stone, Brett Robbins. Let them like helm this thing. They're saying that they want to do it, and they know what they're doing. I mean, I think we see the track record of Dead Space. We see obviously the Callisto Protocol had a shaky launch, but then they fixed it, and now it's awesome. I love the Callisto Protocol. Nonetheless, Glenn Schofield, Christopher Stone, and Brett Robbins were three of the creative leads on the Dead Space games. Schofield said, we tried, actually, the three of us, Dead Space 4, we're talking this year, but he said EA was not interested. We didn't go too deep, Schofield said. They just said, we're not interested right now. We appreciate it, blah, blah, blah. And we know who to talk to. So we didn't take it any further, and we respected their opinion. They know their numbers and what they have to ship and all that. Stone added, the industry being in a weird place with making projects such as Dead Space a hard game to sell. Dude, I'm sorry. I disagree. completely disagree with that. Dead Space, I has a massive audience from the first two Dead Space titles, even the Dead Space remake, the Callisto Protocol. I think the Callisto Protocol was building a nice sized fan base. Sure. Is it as big as Call of Duty? No, of course not, guys. It's not. It's a survival horror game. There's not a lot of survival horror games that are just absolute juggernauts, right? I mean, you look at games like Resident Evil, right? That's been a long withstanding franchise. So it's one of those things. I feel like some of these titles, they just, give it time. They will build over time. But if you don't give it a chance, it's never going to see the light of day. And you got to be very tactical about when you're releasing these games as well. I think that the way that the Dead Space remake was when that was released and when the Callisto Protocol was released just absolutely made no sense. It reminded me of Battlefield 1, Titanfall 2, and Infinite Warfare releasing all within like the same time frame. It doesn't make sense. Why would you do that? So that's what this kind of reminds me of a little bit. And that's why I think that we're really getting, the big survival horror game this year that would be coming out. We don't even know if it's going to be really big, is Chronos, The New Dawn, which seems to be somewhat of a spiritual successor to Dead Space, as well as the Callisto Protocol, even The Thing, maybe a little bit of some Resident Evil in there. But, outside of that, I think that there is a audience that wants games like this. I mean, I really do. We see it in the numbers from like content. We see it in the numbers from, just sales. I mean, there are people who are trying to get games like Dead Space. So nonetheless, people are really hesitant to take chances on things. So you got to take it with a grain of salt. Who knows? Maybe one day, I think we'd all love to do it. Stone then declared he'd make a Dead Space 4. So look, guys, the folks over at Striking Distance Studios, or I should really say, Glenn Schofield, Christopher Stone, Brett Robbins, these guys, the minds behind Dead Space, the minds behind, or I should say, Glenn Schofield helming Dead Space as well as the Callisto Protocol, they want to make another Dead Space title. That should tell you something. Like, if I have Glenn Schofield telling me, hey, we want to do this, and you just have to create barriers of what they can do and stuff, like you give them creative control, obviously, and you just give them like timelines as you would with any other game. I think they can make something absolutely incredible. But if you don't listen to them, like how Crafton dumped a lot of resource and development into the Callisto Protocol, and when push came to shove, they weren't listening to the studio when they should release it, and they released it early, and we kind of had a Cyberpunk 2077 situation just in a survival horror game. So look, will Dead Space 4 ever happen? Guys, I got to tell you, I believe it could happen, but the way I think it happens is EA gives the license to a studio to create the game, similar to what Rockstar is doing with Remedy, with the Max Payne 1 and 2 remake. Give them the license, give them some resource and development, let them do their thing. And that's what I think that they need to do here. I really do. But nonetheless, guys, I would love to hear your thoughts about it in the comment section down below. Where is Dead Space 4? Is Dead Space 4 ever going to happen? Or a Callisto Protocol 2? Or games, more and more like this, the survival horror games that are similar to Dead Space and the Callisto Protocol. What are your guys' thoughts about it? Let us know in the comment section down below, and let us know your thoughts.